Why don't we go ahead and get started? I'm John Haig. I am the co-director of the Mosava Rahmani Center for Business and Government. I want to thank everybody for being here. The title of today's seminar is Building an Electrical Grid for the Future. Clearly a timely topic. I'm very happy to see some of my students here, like Gabriel. Welcome. And we have two people with us. On the screen, we have Litterman, Robert Litterman. And just a little bit of background about Robert. He's a founding partner of something called Kepos Capital, which is a New York-based systematic global macro firm. And he's chairman of the Kepos Capital Risk Committee. But for 23 years before that, he was at Goldman Sachs, and he served in the research, risk management, investment, and thought leadership roles. And oversaw the quantitative investment strategies group and asset management division. So kind of strong orientation on that front. He's done, during his tenure at Goldman, he researched and published papers in asset allocation, risk management. He is the co-developer of something called the Black Litterman Global Asset Allocation Model, and a lot of investment managers use it. And then he chaired the CFTC, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, climate-related market risk subcommittee. So that's the kind of link to some of the issues we're talking about today, from general asset allocation and asset allocation management in an investment context into the climate-related kinds of questions that we're concerned about with the grid. We were talking a little bit beforehand. He was actually teaching for a little bit at MIT with my co-director, Larry Summers. And so there is I think, a long history there of interactions with people affiliated with the center. And the other person we have is Tom Healey, and he's a partner at Healey Development. But Tom was also at Goldman Sachs for decades and decades, and has been, personally, I want to thank Tom, because he's been such a strong supporter of the center, of the school, over many, many years. And he's been here as a fellow for a number of years, working on various issues, and we obviously appreciate that. I could go into I've got a list of about 20 things here that Tom has done, but I think it's more important that we get to the discussion about the electric grid. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Tom and to Bob, and we'll let them walk us through their work.
Good.
Thank
Welcome.
you for coming.
My wife thinks that my major gift is an inability to say no when asked to join organizations. Bob and I tease each other because Bob is blessed with that same gift. And I'm under promise, not very effective, to get rid of one every time I add a new one. But I'll get to this in 2 seconds, but let me start with a question. How many of you own an electric vehicle? How many of you have thought about it? It's interesting because only about 8% of the vehicles sold in the United States last year were electric. It's really, it is more notorious than it is in actuality at the moment. And yet much of the planning of the Biden administration and the administration is based on electric vehicles, the goal being to get to net zero in the United States. How many of you think that getting to net zero in the United States is crucial? Or maybe the easier question is how many, well, possible I'm going to talk about, Bob and I are going to talk about, but does anybody think it's not crucial? That's too bad, because it improves the discussion if we can get somebody on that side. I suspect the Kennedy School doesn't have many, but
Tom, I'm sure you're saying net zero by 2050. That was implicit.
Well,
it depends when.
It is, right. It is indeed. And and 90 major countries, including the U.S. and China and Russia and India, and not Russia, but India, have all committed to that. And what we're going to talk about, which is one key component, which is the transmission lines. So we're in a massive drive as a country to reach 100% clean electricity by 2035, not net zero, led by the promise of wind and solar. Along that road, the main challenge isn't going to be to produce enough electricity. We'll make a lot of electricity with solar. We'll make a lot of electricity with wind power, although maybe it's struggling a little bit on the coasts, at least in the East Coast, where I live in New Jersey and where we live in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. It's proving to be challenged. But we can make the electricity, but how do we connect it from where it's produced to where it's needed? That's the difficulty that I want to discuss. The current system designed for fossil fuel and oil and natural gas and coal and uranium must be recreated to meet the needs of a different world. What I'm going to talk about quickly is 6 different items. The history of the grid, what the grid is like today, what the future need looks like, what are the problems in getting to that, a potential solution, which is actually just a spoiler alert, modeled on the interstate highway system, and then what are the issues going forward. I'm hoping, I don't know if it's going to stir controversy since everybody agrees with the basic premise, but I hope it stirs lots of discussion. Please feel free to interrupt with questions or at the end. But today, in order to meet that clean energy demand, the United States will have to triple its electric transmission capacity by 2050. Instead of speeding up to meet this challenge, transmission line in the United States is slowing down. Between 2012 and 2016, we built an average of 2,000 miles of lines every year. 4 years later, from 2017 to 2021, the yearly average dropped to just 700. In 2023, last year, we built only 251 miles of transmission. Now, depending on whose estimates you use, we probably need about 5,000 miles a year between now and 2050. So we didn't do our fair share last year, and it's discouraging going forward. And where it's really a particular challenge, as I'll get into, is the regulatory issues. And in getting the distribution grid up and going. And I'll give you some examples of where it's not working as well as it might. So history, what is the grid? There are actually 3 parts to our electric system. You have generation, that's the power plants that create the electricity. You have distribution, that's the part near your house that actually takes it through a transformer into your own house. And then the part that we're focused on is the transmission system, which is what brings it from one major area to another. The first commercial operation of electric systems, anybody know when and where? 1882. Pearl Street Station in New York City. Edison's first great contribution. 1892, 10 years later, Boston actually connected 3 different generating plants. So that was the first sort of, if you can call it, modern power system. In 1926, we created the first major interstate system between Boston and Chicago. Today's technology is pretty similar to what was used in the Pearl Street station. We really haven't made major, it's a wire. You spin a turbine that creates the electricity, you attach it to a wire, and you wire it to where it needs to go. Uh, it we use two phase, which Tesla created. Edison's original version didn't work anywhere near as well, and we don't use it. But the technology hasn't changed very much. To get to our 100% clean electricity by 2035, so I'm saying clean electricity by 2035, net zero by 50. That's roughly the administration's outline. We absolutely need to double the grid, and I think that's probably almost physically impossible. So what's our electric system look like? We have 3,100 different electric utilities in the United States that produce it. About 1,000 of them are municipal or owned by towns. The largest of those is Seattle. Seattle's whole electric system is owned by the town. It's not owned by a private company. The sources are obviously coal, gas, oil, and nuclear. Those four very roughly each provide about 20%, a little bit from hydro and a little bit from geothermal. The consumption of electricity, who uses it today, last year, it grew 3% last year. I'll get back to the growth in a second. 35% of that's residential. And the average electric bill, what do you think the average electric bill is in the United States? Any guesses? 1,000? Anybody higher? Anybody lower? John? Lower? For a month. Sorry, good. It's 115. So it's not the hugest part of most people's budget. We use high voltage direct current lines for this system, for the strong part of the system. And just to give you a dimension of how backward the United States is, France, which is a much denser, smaller country, has 22,000 miles of distribution lines. We have 2,500. 22,000 to 2,500. We have a unbelievably balkanized regulatory structure. There are 8 U.S. so-called electric reliability councils. These are geographically located and responsible for organizing the electric system in different areas. Texas is the only state that has its own, and it's not interconnected with the rest. If you remember when Texas had its bad cold weather a year ago, it's because they couldn't borrow any from their neighbors. But beside the electric liability councils, FERC, the Federal Electric Reliability Commission in New York, in Washington is the major regulatory government, federal regulatory. But there are also 49 state regulators. I don't know which state it is that doesn't have one, but there's only one state that doesn't have a regulatory system. And they're responsible for approving new plants, setting rates, all of those kinds of things. Today, there are 10,000 projects seeking permission to interconnect. I saw another study that said it's 3,000. So you pick your own. It turned out that both studies were sourced from the Rand Corporation. So maybe it was done on different floors of their office building. Um, I'd probably pick the smaller, but even at 3,000, there are a lot, and the median time to get permission is is at least 3 years, and then 2 years to build it. But that doesn't always work. Let me stop for a second and talk about gaming the system. If you're a private equity firm and you think that we're going to need a lot more transmission, what you do is you put in an application, and say you put an application in between Boston and Indianapolis. You pick your cities. You don't need to have power in Boston or Indianapolis. You don't need to have an, any power. You just need to fill out the form and pay a small fee. And so people are obviously, it's stopped now, but we're saying, well, gee, that's a free option. It's taking so long to get those permissions. Once I get a permission, I can go sell it to a utility that'll actually use it. Well, the FERC cracked down on that and now says that the permits have to be done according to what's ready to go first in line, which makes a lot more sense rather than what was filed first. If I'd been smarter, Bob, if you'd been, you and I could have filed one,
Right.
right? And then sold it to local.
Right. Why didn't we get in that business?
Exactly. Exactly. So let me dig a little deeper into this regulatory problem. The demand for electricity in the US for the last 15 years essentially been flat, zero. It was up 3% last year, but it has been flat. The best estimate I've seen by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, which is a federal non-for-profit that measures these things, is that the next 5 years we need to increase 25%. That's a big and so if you think about it, why is it up 3% after it's been flat for 15 years? Think of all the new needs. Anybody want? What's the favorite? What's anybody's favorite new need for electricity? Bitcoin and AI. AI. Anything else? Come on, you all have a lot of imagination. E-vehicles. E-vehicles get it twice. Once to manufacture them, and then wants to run them. Cloud computing, battery and solar manufacturing. All of these, everybody is using all the electricity they can get. Georgia, for some reason, is a hub of this. They have 19 times as many applications as they have ability to interconnect. I don't know why Georgia, but Georgia has gotten a lot of EV energy and seems to be a place where people like to do crypto. And the problem physically, this is very crude, but solar basically comes from the south, the center, and wind basically comes from the north center. And where we need it is the two coasts. And so we have to figure out how to move it. Okay, I'm going to move ahead. I'm going to define two problems in this energy system. And one is finance. The leading study of this is done by called Net Zero net zero America study, and Jane is nodding her head. That was done by Princeton, and I would say, Bob, did you use that at all in any of your work? I would say, if
No,
you look at the
no.
literature, that's become sort of the dominant. They put all the work in and came up with a very credible study that everybody can use for their planning. Bob sent me one study of the grid and the electric system for the next 50 years that was all in calculus. I'm not sure the calculus helps. The but the um, uh, so they estimate at least $2.4 trillion is a need, and I've seen other estimates that would have it for as high as 4 trillion or more, uh, which is obviously a lot of money. Now, Biden is very proud of the fact that he put money for the grid in the EVA. There's 65 billion for the grid, so that's barely a down payment on a down payment. Now, how should we finance it? I think that we could probably all agree that it should be funded broadly rather than just on new users, and it should be in some way fair, and that the fee should probably be on all users, both household and industrial. It's actually hard to do sometimes. Any the ones of you who have EVs, do you have chargers in your garage? If you so a charger in your garage is roughly $10,000 to $15,000. I don't have one. Does that sound right to anybody who's ever? And so if you put a charger in, you spend $15,000. Your neighbor doesn't. Now, your neighbor doesn't have an EV, but is that fair? Shouldn't it be spread across all users, because everybody benefits from the getting rid of the carbon in the system? The give you an example of some of the problems. Just I'm saying that transmission's a problem. I want to go down to even a narrower problem. There's an article yesterday in the Wall Street Journal on transformers. Transformers are the if you think about it, when you look at an electric pole, you see a big tall pole and wires attached, and there's a box up top there. Sometimes it's open, sometimes it's closed. Maybe the size of half the size of that white cabinet over there, like a big box. That's the transformer. Edison used transformers, and transformers are not much different than the ones that Edison used. We are putting in 1 million new transformers a year, mostly replacing transformers that wear out. So that doesn't get any of the transformers we need for this increase in supplies. Mostly transformers are made where? Where's everything made? China. We have the special steel needed for transformers. There's only one company in the United States that makes that steel today, which is a company called Cleveland Cliffs. So another chokehold by China. All right, so switch to the second problem. I said there were two problems. One is financing, $3 or $4 trillion. That's not hard. The other is this siting and permitting problem. Because if you build, as Bob and I did, where would we go from from Boston to Indianapolis? You cross cities, towns, private property, counties, states, all of whom have and want to have a view in this process. And FERC did a study of the siting and transmitting issue, and just to read quickly what their conclusion was. Transmission planning, siting, and permitting functions in the United States are fractured between federal, tribal, I forgot tribes, federal, tribal, regional, state, and local entities. Many entities involved can only focus on considerations in their jurisdiction, no authority or guidance to account for benefits that cross borders. These decentralized and silos processes make financing and building interstate transmission lines challenging, resulting in a lengthy permitting process. These challenges apply both interregional and intra-regional lines that cross state borders. So even within the power agreements or the 8 systems are among them. Let me give you 3 quick examples. The Transwest Express project from Wyoming to Arizona, California, and Nevada took 15 years to get all its approvals. And then it took 6 years to complete it. So total of 21 years. Remember 21 for a minute. The New Mexico to Arizona line, which is called Sunrise, that's charming, 17 years to reach agreements. They had to involve 10 federal agencies, 5 state agencies, 9 local authorities. Those 2 at least got done. My third example is the New England Clean Energy Connection. Anyone ever heard of that? Dan? It's from Quebec to New England. It basically is designed to bring hydropower down to New England. It makes good logical sense. Hydropower is the least expensive and the cleanest of power sources. We need it down here. 59% of the voters in Maine rejected it as on a ballot. So it never got built. I don't know why they rejected it, but I just principle. So a new project today, 2024, wouldn't send power in the current regulatory situation until 2044. And we need to remember that our goal is decentralization in 2035. So we're at least 9 years short, unless we can shrink this, or maybe we're 9 years long. Now there are things you can do to be practical, at least I think, and maybe I'm an optimist. Any of you know me, know I'm an optimist. John will swear I'm an optimist. One way is to use existing right-of-way, interstate highways, rail corridors, because then you don't need new permissions from people who want to hold you up. But what we really need is a centralized governing body of some kind or another with broad powers to set policies, resolve disputes, including the right of eminent domain. I'm hoping we can talk about eminent domain and see what the feelings are of the people in this room. But it can be done. And even the EU, which is its own hornet's nest of regulatory delight, approved a rebuttable for their electricity, a rebuttable presumption of overriding public interest and a very limited environmental impact investment assessment. Okay, so those are the 2 problems. I'd like to suggest a model of something that we have done in this country that can be a model for that, which is the interstate highway system. not terribly controversial. There's some controversy, but not terribly. It was created in the 50s by President Eisenhower. He defined that it was a matter of national security to be able to transport uh, armies and materials across the United States. It was financed by a federal tax on gasoline. Anybody guess how much that tax is? Pardon? It started at 3 and now it's 5. So a relatively modest tax accumulated over a long enough period of time can be very effective. It financed about 90% of the interstate highway system. It finances about 70% of the maintenance today. Today's dollars, the amount of money raised would be about $600 billion. $600 billion. It's 47,000 miles long. There was little initial opposition. Actually, there was great delight as it is a solution. Over time, it's run into controversy because of urban displacement. Sometimes it just ran helter-skelter through the middle of cities. I've seen estimates that it displaced as many as 1 million people, and that tends to displace poorer people because the land is cheaper. The other area that has created some uproar is environmental. There's a section that never got completed in New Jersey because it went through a mountain range, and the people objected to running the interstate. But in the main, it's been free of major problems. Now, the U.S. spent $600 billion on electricity last year. If we had a 10% tax fee, I would call it a user fee. There's some people who don't like the word taxes. It raised $60 billion a year. If we increase that 5% a year as a general rise, we'd raise $750 billion over 10 years and over $2.5 trillion by 2050. So we would get the bulk of the financing done. And going back to the average electric bill of $120, 10% is $12 a month for each of us. Now, some tell me that that's so simple it'll never work, but the highway, the interstate highway system did have eminent domain authority and did have approvals to override local opposition. So what are the issues going forward? The same issues I've been talking about. We need time and will to accomplish the financing and accomplishing the permission. And the incumbents have a lot of power to block future transmission. Not only someone who doesn't want a transmission line across their backyard, but the oil and coal industries have been resistant for reasons that are fairly obvious. But we have actually accomplished in Washington, in gas pipelines, a law permitting the Mountain Valley Pipeline project, and that gas pipeline was allowed eminent domain authority. So we have done it. We have done it in the Congress. So having proved it could be done, and just to end on the environmental battles, and I'm quoting the former dean of the MI school, Sloan School. He says that it will be the mother of all environmental battles. I don't know whether I hope that isn't true. And then I'd love to know what people here think. But the other thing that I'm willing to guarantee you, and then I'm going to turn it over to Bob, I guarantee it is going to cost more than Princeton's $4 trillion estimate. And I guarantee it'll take more time. None of us have ever seen a major project, especially those of us in Boston who smiled at the big dig. That what takes years take decades, and what takes billions takes trillions. But we have to get there. So Bob, John's given you a nice introduction. Bob is one of the country's literally specialists in risk management, and has done a lot of work in climate on a variety of projects, not just his work with the CFTC. Bob, comments both on the grid and the carbon problem in general.
Thank you, Tom. And I just want to say it's a pleasure to be presenting with you again. I'm not sure this will enhance our credibility here, but you recall that the last time we were presenting together, it was to the Central States Teamsters in the context of managing their portfolio.
I do remember.
Yeah. You mentioned the paper with calculus, and it reminded me of a presentation we made in Chicago where I started talking about adding up volatilities, and one of the Teamsters representatives said, "Why don't they sum?" And I said something about, well, you need to take correlations and square roots into account. And he wasn't too pleased with that answer either. But anyway, you've really covered this topic well. I want to start by highlighting a very recent paper from the Niskanen Center, which is a relatively new Washington-based think tank that believes in free markets and effective government. And just 2 weeks ago, Niskanen published a paper titled "Siting, Leasing, and Permitting of Clean Energy Infrastructure in the United States" by Kenneth Searcy and Johan Cavert. Now, I'm not an expert in the electrical grid, but I happen to chair the board of the Niskanen Center, which last year Time Magazine named as the most interesting think tank in American politics. And Siting, Leasing, and Permitting is a very good paper. It's an excellent roadmap of the problem and potential solutions, including policy. And the big picture, as Tom has said, is that we have a grid built to facilitate a world of fossil fuel-based electricity generation. The system was designed to facilitate the incumbent fossil-based generators, and the resulting outdated government regulations and processes for connection need to be improved. The report from Niskanen states that the siting, leasing, and permitting stages of clean energy infrastructure development are increasingly presenting obstacles to private firms developing electric generation and transmission, even as demand led by AI accelerates. And without getting into the details, which are readily referenced in depth in the Niskanen paper, the existing grid was built and connections are being managed and governed primarily by local authorities, as Tom said. And this made sense when generating facilities were generally located nearby cities. Moreover, the existing grid was built for the weather of the past 100 years. And just like all infrastructure, the grid has to be upgraded to meet the weather of the next 100 years, which will alone be quite expensive. And the grid also needs to be upgraded to meet the electricity generation of the next 100 years. And the grid of the future will, as Tom suggested, require significant long-distance transmission of solar and wind power from where it is plentiful and cheap to produce to cities where it's needed. And this long-distance extension of the grid is a complex, multi-decadal planning problem. And therefore, the grid of the future requires federal design, construction, regulation, and governance. And I also want to focus on urgency. I come at this renewable energy transmission with, as Tom mentioned, a background in financial risk management. And I have one fundamental message about risk management. Time itself is a scarce resource, and it has to be managed. Almost any problem can be solved if you have enough time. With climate risk, we don't know how much time we have. Building the grid, we know, is going to take decades. In climate risk management, we need to be prepared for a worst case scenario in which the planet is more fragile, tipping points are coming sooner, and the renewable energy transition has to go much faster. We have to be prepared for that pessimistic scenario. And the basic problem causing climate change is that we're not pricing climate risk. The International Monetary Fund estimates that the subsidies to fossil fuels were $7 trillion in 2022 alone. Let that sink in. I know millions, billions, trillions, they all sound large. This is 7% of global GDP. That's the size of the subsidy to burning fossil fuel. It's just astronomical. The lack of pricing of the externalities associated with burning fossil fuels, in particular PM 2.5 particulate pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, constitutes most of that subsidy. You know, if you don't price externalities, capitalism doesn't work. Because of that insanely large subsidy to fossil fuels, the energy transition is off track. According to Bloomberg New Energy Finance, the global investment in renewable energy and the electrical grid infrastructure needs to grow about 25% per year, every year between now and 2030, just to be on track for net zero by 2050. We have not yet recognized the danger created by fossil fuels. But when society does recognize the dire nature of climate risk and actually does create appropriate incentives to reduce emissions, we need a grid that can handle that accelerated transition. That means we need to get work on it right now. We need to make it a high priority, and we need legislation to ensure appropriate federal leadership. The good news is, at least for my friends on the government affairs areas of Niskanen and the Woodwell Climate Research Center, where I also am on the board, is that bipartisan transmission reform legislation is now being worked on, and depending on election results, could be agreed upon as early as next year. So, Tom, with that, I'll turn it back over to you and happy to take questions.
Good. How do you want to do this, John?
We can open it up.
Yeah.
I will try to hold my questions and let everybody else have a chance, but I certainly have a few that I would like to ask as well. Claire is going to hand around the microphone. I'd ask you to speak into it. We actually, a little diversion here for a second. There is evidently a new policy at the Kennedy School that you can only come to these seminars if you have a Harvard ID of some sort. So we have a number of people online. So you need to use the microphone to make sure they can hear your question as well. So start Gabriel and then Dan and then Allison.
Hello, can you hear me? Thank you. So I'm currently finalizing a dissertation on exactly this problem, although in the UK. And particularly looking at the problem of NIMBYism when it comes to the grid. So you mentioned the 59% of Maine voters that voted against having overhead line built. And we've been looking a lot, particularly at community benefit models, so models that try and distribute some kind of payment or financial benefit to communities that would host this infrastructure as a way of trying to build support and reduce the opposition that comes from communities to building this stuff. I was wondering if you could comment a bit on these kinds of community benefit approaches, and perhaps if you don't know so much about that, more broadly, what you think the community engagement process needs to look like to address that kind of NIMBY problem.
You want to start, Bob? Because one of the clear conclusions of the Niskanen study was the community engagement part.
Yeah, no, the community engagement part is important. And Tom, I think you kind of highlighted some of the issues that come up when we were building the interstate highway system. Similar issues come up here. Which communities are going to be benefited? Which communities are going to be harmed? but it's all a matter of degree. And I guess what I would say is when you take time into account and say it's a scarce resource, then we have to address these issues, but we have to address them with urgency. And there is plenty of work that's being done on how to address it and how to make these trade-offs, because there are trade-offs. And, you know, there are going to be folks that are hurt and others that are made, well, we're all made better off. And there are people that are hurt. And so your suggestion that all of us should compensate those who need to be compensated makes perfect sense. It would be my answer. I don't know, Tom.
Well, in a different context, but very related, proposals for a carbon tax, which Bob has spent a lot of time on, which have never gotten any place in the United States, or basically never gotten. One of the best took some, if not all, of the carbon tax money and redistributed it broadly across everybody, so that everybody was getting something back and that there was a little bit of carrot with the stick. That's harder in the transmission case, because my argument is we need all the carrots we can get to build the finance the transmission. So I don't know where we find more to pay people, but your question is a very good one. Part of my answer is in the using existing right of ways that don't cause the disruption of new ones. But it is a giant problem, and as the dean of MIT said, we're going to have a big fight over it.
Well, Tom, I would just second your suggestion that there be a carbon tax. The IMF notes that instead of costing government $7 trillion a year, if you put a carbon tax on, you would have revenues of $4 trillion a year. You'd offset a lot of that fossil fuel burning, and that money could easily pay for you know, the extension.
And we'd need only a small slice of it to do our transmission.
Exactly.
And
thanks, Tom and Bob. Really interesting stuff. So one small challenge and then a question. You mentioned that populations will be disparately affected by this and people should be appropriately compensated. What models from the past do you look for in this type of large disruption to the American landscape where people have been properly compensated that you would base this on? And if there isn't such a model, how would you develop one? That's the challenge. The question is about how clean is electric energy. My understanding is that how clean it is really depends on where it's coming from. So can you sort of disaggregate that a bit for us? Thanks.
I'll leave the second one from Bob, because I don't know that, and maybe he doesn't have one either. Clearly, we have hundreds of years of experience with when you do have a taking of using the court system to educate what's a fair payment for it. I have a gas pipe. I live on a farm in New Jersey, and I have a gas pipeline running down the back of the farm, and they had to write me a small check for the permission to dig through and keep the. So there is that in terms of the local case. There is at least that explanation. How you get a more powerful carrot in, and the question of the gentleman from England, I think it's interesting to think about, because I haven't heard a lot of great solutions.
Yeah, I with respect to, you know, cleanness, I guess the big picture is that we're moving to transform a lot of what had been dirty activities, such as driving internal combustion engine vehicles, into clean activities, such as driving, you know, an electric vehicle. Now, you know, one of the things that people say about the electric vehicle is, well, how clean it is depends on the energy that was used to produce it and the energy that you use to drive it. And of course, that's true. And all I would say is that's why you need to create appropriate incentives by pricing carbon. And then everyone has the right incentives, and they make the right decisions without doing any complex internal calculations. You just operate to do things as cheaply as you can. And then the electrical system will get decarbonized appropriately, and people will make the right decisions about when and what kind of vehicles to buy and where to live and whether to insulate their house or not. You give people appropriate incentives and they make the right decisions, and it's decentralized. That's all. It's pretty
just to
straightforward.
underscore Bob's point, that virtually every economist in the world argues that we should have a carbon tax as a way of trying to resolve that part of the problem. And the beauty of it is you don't have government figuring out how to allocate it. The market does it automatically. But that's too simple and straightforward for our country.
Well, the good news here, I think, is that there is a good possibility for bipartisan solution, and both Republicans and Democrats see the value here of building out the grid and doing it.
You and I have been talking about these issues for at least 5 years, Bob, and every year there's an election. You promise me we're going to have bipartisan action afterwards, and it doesn't seem to occur.
Well, I have to admit I've been disappointed, but I'm an optimist like you.
Allison Shapira. I'm familiar with companies like Anbaric, which is a renewable energy transmission company based here in Massachusetts. I'm wondering, are we looking at the private sector for that kind of innovation? And then what innovations in grid scale energy storage have there been to increase grid capacity? And can they effectively address load balancing as well?
Before you answer that question, I had a question that kind of piggybacks on what Allison was starting to allude to. When I was this is a little bit of an anecdote. When I was a management consultant, we made somebody and worked at AT&T, we made somebody a lot of money. And that person was Phil Anschutz. And Phil Anschutz owned the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. And what we did was teach him how to build a fiber optic backbone telecommunication network using the right-of-ways on his rail. And it worked out really well for him, for us to some extent, but much more for him. And the question really in the back of that is, how do we think about utilizing the private sector and some of these existing kind of, not just companies that do transmission, but kind of because it seems to me the big thing is the rights of way and kind of how are you going to actually get the permissions to go across these properties and lands, and a lot of that exists with these rights of way for example for railroads.
Well, I'd answer your question in two parts. The right of way just needs dollars. It needs dollars and negotiating skills, and pipelines have those because they've done it. They've done it for decades. But I think the storage problem, which is really the problem, is vitally important. But it's so big, we're not going to get it solved. That's going to be a longer, more difficult slog than even the grid, and maybe the same orders of magnitude. There have been encouragements of new technology making storage cheaper, which is really what we need. And there are lots of interesting ideas. Everybody using their Tesla for battery storage at night, but something of that magnitude, I think it'll be part of the solution, but we can't look at it for the total solution, because you really end up with a system where not only do you have power created in the wrong place, but at the wrong time of day. You want to add?
Well, I agree with everything you said, Tom. I would, what would I add? We are depending on the private sector, and going back to carbon pricing, if we give people the right incentives, they're going to make the right decisions. And remember that right now, everyone has the wrong incentives. we don't have incentives to produce backup storage. At least we don't have strong enough incentives. And so we're not devoting enough resources to any of these activities. But I'm sure if we did provide those incentives, the private sector would step up and would develop all of these backup storage requirements. There, as Tom said, there's many different types of backup storage. Batteries are certainly an important one. And I would only point out that you need a different type of battery for grid storage. It doesn't have to be lightweight. It can be very heavy. So, you know, there's different types of batteries that need to be developed, and we need to incentivize that. And I'll just say it one more time: when you have $7 trillion of subsidies to the old technology, you know, entrepreneurs and investors are not incentivized enough to develop the technologies that we need. So there you have it.
People are working on potential breakthroughs to better transmission systems. There's never been an incentive for somebody to say we should design transmission that's cheaper or more efficient, because everybody was happy with what we had. But a lot of there are things of better transformers and better conductors, and it would be nice to hope we could get a breakthrough in that someday. Like we have had a breakthrough in battery cost.
But even with those breakthroughs, and let's hope and expect that they come, we need a federal governance system that, you know, does the overall planning for the grid of the future, because it's a federal system. It's not going to be a local system.
Hi, my name is Justin Sturm, second year MPID student here at the Kennedy School. And I want to talk about the grid build out from the wind channel in the middle of the country to the two coasts that you mentioned. And you mentioned the 20-year time frame that it took to build several transmission lines towards the West Coast. But building out west, you're dealing with relatively few stakeholders, large landholders, federal, state, but it's largely unpopulated. If you were to build from that resource-rich vein in the middle of the country out east, you're dealing with so many more small stakeholders.
Like the third example I used was Maine, where Maine turned it down.
Right. So is there anything that makes you think that 20 years is not a best case scenario for building out a transmission line? Are there any shortcuts that you see in that side of the country?
We need to have federal override of permitting. And we need one system, a rebuttable, like the EU approved, and a process, and you set a court for educating disputes so that it's quick and done. And you know, our court system is an enormously inefficient way of trying to do permitting and siting. I think I probably should have said that. That seems to me obvious, but that's. So we need another system.
Yeah, I would just add, we just have to think of time as a scarce resource.
Right.
That's all. It is a scarce resource, and we have to prioritize.
Yeah, because the problem is by the time we don't have enough electricity, it's too late to do anything about it.
Exactly.
I was wondering if I could play devil's advocate and ask about the possibility of mini grids. For example, solar panels are so much more sensitive now. They are DC. DC grids are, they lose less energy, especially at shorter distances. Densely populated towns could form their own microgrids. I understand that doesn't resolve for the issue of backup, but it resolves a lot of the other load balancing, battery size, all other issues. Why are we not considering that?
I'll start. I think I see a lot of it. I see a lot of it by the major technology companies in their campuses. Almost all of them are developing their own grids. I have a friend who's head of infrastructure at Google. His budget a year is $18 billion a year. And most of that goes into power related dollars. And so when you see them, I haven't seen what Tesla's done in Texas, but I'm sure it's self-gridded for all the reasons you say. You can make it efficient.
Sorry, so I was just wondering, is it not scalable? Because it bypasses a lot of this eminent domain issues, environmental issues.
Well, but the problem is that the users are every place, and we have a system that believes that the farm in Montana or New Hampshire has as much right to electricity as the person in downtown Boston. So it can maybe improve things, but it doesn't fundamentally solve the problem. You can have it doesn't solve the fundamental problem that where we're producing the electricity and where it's needed are different, and we need to move them between each other. I mean, that's a problem of physics, it's not a moral problem.
I'm going to take I have a couple questions. I'll get to you in a second, Jane. Okay. So two quick, one comment and then one observation and one kind of question. The comment is Bill Hogan just sent me the new Nordhaus dice model calculations, which I haven't had a chance to read through the paper, but I would guess the social cost of carbon calculation, my understanding, has gone up in the new version. So your $7 trillion number may be on the low side.
Absolutely.
Right.
I think the IMF number for the social cost of carbon is around $70 a ton. And I think Bill's new paper is somewhere in that range, but I would certainly have a higher number. And I would point out that the social cost of carbon is it's a very uncertain economic concept. And so there's a lot of uncertainty what it really is. Economists tend to choose a median value from this range of uncertainty. And as a risk manager, I would say, well, what if you have too low a number? If you want to be certain that you're going to solve this problem and avoid a catastrophe, you want to be at the high end of that distribution of uncertainty. So anyway, yeah, I would use a number like $200 a ton, and then that 7 trillion would be more than 10 trillion. And by the way, the US component of that 7 trillion would be over $1 trillion, which I think is a reasonable estimate of what the subsidy in the US is today, $1 trillion per year. And think of the magnitude of that relative to the meager subsidies to clean energy, which in the IRA were estimated at $369 billion over 10 years originally. Now Goldman thinks, because it's uncapped, that it might be as much as 100 billion a year, but that's 100 billion versus $1 trillion.
Right.
Hogan, by the way, apologizes. He's giving his own talk, right?
Yeah, he did tell me he's apologized that he couldn't be here. The observation question, I guess, is, obviously, at least for me, the interstate highway analog kind of has a lot of appeal. But when I simplify a little bit, we're trying to figure out how to get the electricity from where it's generated to where it's needed. And we've talked about the distribution grid necessary to do that. We haven't talked about how to think about maybe the opportunities to place the need closer to where it's generated. And in particular, Tom, when you were talking about AI, for example, I talk to people like Amazon Web Services is an old colleague of mine, the guy that runs it, and they're putting their new cloud computing, kind of data storage centers, and they're actually trying to build them where they can get reserve power, right? So they're actually reducing the demand for the distribution by trying to avoid having to worry about it.
Well, an even stronger example of that is the crypto. Crypto is
It's another version of what I'm talking about because it's highly energy
crypto is
demanding, hugely energy.
You know, doing it in Norway where you have cheap hydro.
Right. Jane, you had a question. We've got.
Hi. I'm Clark Freifeld. I work for a startup company called New Grid, which does topology optimization for the transmission infrastructure. My question relates to how utilities make money. And my understanding is a lot of the way they make money is through massive capital projects. Basically, they spend a lot of money and then they get paid whatever they spend plus 10%, which in some sense is a good thing because it's an incentive for them to invest in, for example, transmission projects, because the bigger the project, the more they get paid. The problem is with, for example, my company, our technology saves utilities money, it saves the ratepayers money. It allows you to get more out of your existing transmission infrastructure. But there isn't an incentive for utilities to really invest in our technology because saving the ratepayers money doesn't really make money for utilities. So I'm just curious your comments on that and how we can sort of
we're
optimize
starting
that.
to see regulatory commissions be sensitive to that and look at different ways that, for instance, allowing them to put energy savings devices in consumers' home, and the utilities put that into their rate base, which 10 years ago they never would have done. See, at the regulatory level, you can adjust mechanisms to give an incentive to the private sector to spend the money and measure it not just in new volts given, but in volts avoided. It's relatively complicated, and they've found, at least especially in California, that they've been overcompensated, people with solar roofs selling power back to the utility, that they're getting too much money, and all the other consumers are paying more for electricity than they should have to. So it's not a trivial problem, but at the regulatory level, a clever regulatory organization can work with that. So good luck to your company.
Thanks, Tom and Bob. I'm Jane Nelson here, Director of our Corporate Responsibility Initiative. Two questions. One, why do you think we're not sort of seeing more concerted policy advocacy from corporate America? I mean, the Business Roundtable obviously has been advocating for permitting reform. There's growing advocacy around a price on carbon. But what do you think more could be done to sort of increase policy advocacy collectively from the sort of 1,000 largest corporations, financial institutions in the States? And then a second, probably too large question, but what are your sort of thoughts on the links between this discussion and the critical minerals? You mentioned sort of some of the manufacturing constraints, but clearly we also have a critical minerals constraint, and the same sort of permitting challenges are very sort of valid there for developing critical minerals, particularly here in the United States.
You want to try either of those, Bob?
Yeah, I'll start with the first one, why it's so difficult to get businesses to lobby for this. It's because businesses have their own priorities. And in most cases, their priorities are not cleaning up the grid. And in some cases, cleaning up the grid and a more rapid transition to a clean economy is going to be definitely bad for their profitability. Certainly pricing carbon is not going to be good for oil companies. And yet, I co-chair the Climate Leadership Council with Catherine Murdoch, and we have, the Climate Leadership Council, what is it, the Baker-Schultz Carbon Dividend Plan, And we had virtually unanimous support from the business community, including oil and gas firms, including the American Petroleum Institute. I mean, so I would say today, the business community is 100% in favor of appropriate incentives to reduce emissions. In fact, I would say sane people are all in favor of it, but the politics right now is so tough. And what the Republicans say right now is, you know, give me baby steps. I'm not going to get a carbon tax over the line, but, you know, let's do things that we can agree on. And I would say cleaning up the grid is something that is very much in the realm of possibility in the near term.
So the critical minerals, certainly there are a lot of private sector money, risk money going into that area, but it's risky. The price of lithium, I don't know if you watch the price of lithium, which is down 90% in the last year, and no one can really explain why. I would recommend to everybody a wonderful, and then I'm going to run, a wonderful book called The Material World. And it is about 6 materials that are vital to our world. And it's the writer is a British television commentator. He's not a he's not a scientist. He's not an academic, but he's very visual and very dramatic. And the first one he talks about is salt. He said that is, so think for a second, what are the 6 you picked? Let's see if I can remember most of them. But salt was the first mined material in Babylon on the shores of the Mediterranean. See, as salt, copper, steel, oil, I'm missing one, and lithium. It's a fabulous book. It's beautifully written, and you know, his depiction of the mining of lithium in Chile, which is the biggest place in the Western world, it's unbelievable. It's a place I'd never want to visit.
All right, terrific. I want to thank Tom and Bob for taking the time with us. Very much appreciated.